Well, no one ever plans in life to have a rare disease, right? So I was diagnosed with Cushing's disease in 2020 as an adult. And Cushing's disease is a pituitary tumor behind your eyes at the base of the brain. And my lovely background picture showcases that. And that tumor causes dangerous levels of cortisol to be produced over an excessive period of time, typically years until diagnosed. And Cushing's isn't considered a cancerous disease, but there are rare cases when it can be. So, at first I was having a horrible time transitioning into being an older woman, perhaps entering perimenopause, being over 40, et cetera, all those things. And thought to myself, wow, this really sucks. And I can't believe this is what growing older is going to feel like. And so it wasn't until symptoms became debilitating and I needed to actually quit my career at age 43. And did I then really start to question my medical state? Up until then, I followed doctor's orders, continued to see different specialists for different issues I was having, and so much time and energy and money and waiting, to feel better. But I knew, in my gut, this couldn't be right, and it wasn't until I was scheduled for my annual physical with my general doctor, and I just sat down, wrote down every symptom I had. It didn't matter how small or insignificant that it might be, just anything that wasn't my normal. Mm-hmm. And when I did that activity, I realized how much I had actually gotten used to, what I was just putting up with on a day-to-day basis. And I think it's also fortunate that because my doctor knew me, having been her patient for 15, 20 years, she understood the changes. She knew I wasn't making up something or, just had that reality set in. And then based on some preliminary test results of cortisol, she sent me to an endocrinologist. And I guess I say that I'm lucky that my labs were so clearly showing issues that sometimes other Cushing's patients don't have a clear path to diagnosis. So was diagnosed with Cushing's, and then I had surgery just 2 weeks after my diagnosis. When you're trying to prepare for brain surgery, you've got so many things going through your head. And I had never even heard of the disease, nor barely had time to prepare for having that. The surgery itself was successful, but then the shift happened. I began learning more about my disease once I got through that, and then what information I could actually find about it. And everything was pointing to actually not getting what I think is the proper care that I would needed after treatment. It was then, almost losing my life, did I really start a different kind of self-advocacy. And I say it was different because already you have to be a self-advocate just to get the diagnosis. And then advocacy sort of just comes out of necessity. It was emotional and traumatizing roller coaster of, the anger, the relief, and then you have hope, disappointment, frustration, and depression, and you're just feeling plain exhausted. And I think this was after having treatment and being in remission, all of this was still around. And I didn't want other patients who were diagnosed after me to struggle the same way that I did. And I just wanted to learn, support, and educate and fight for those that weren't able to fight for themselves. They had other struggles that couldn't allow them to maybe speak up on their behalf. Mm-hmm. So since I no longer had a full-time career, I started volunteering with a patient advocacy organization, and it didn't matter how, I just started, right? And I learned where my skills fit in the best, and it felt like it was supposed to sort of be my new path in life. And now I'm speaking in webinars, like this, attending more patient advocacy learning opportunities, trying to help anyone that needs support, whether it's a patient or an industry leader or a clinician or even research students. And so it's sort of like, I feel like I'm finding another purpose in life. Yeah, well, being diagnosed as a rare disease patient, you're thrown into advocacy out of necessity, like you said, and it starts with self-advocacy. Then if there's time and mental space and ability to do more, then it turns into advocacy work with others and for others. And, I volunteered in the beginning and learned from others in the space, talked with other patients, and saw my professional skill set being integrated into that work. And I started volunteering with the Minnesota Rare Disease Advisory Council as a patient advocacy leader. And that led to meeting a University of Minnesota professor in pharmacy, and was invited to talk to pharmaceutical students about rare disease, and I was like, how great is that to see that involvement and that initiative being taken in their course, and so things just started to become more natural in a way, and finding out where I fit in. And despite important advancements in my disease, or in neuroendocrine tumor research, we call it NETS for short, a critical gap still remained between scientific breakthroughs and patient outcomes, because they're understudied, like pituitary tumors. So I started NETTRO. NETTRO is the Neuroendocrine Tumor Translational Research Organization. It's kind of a mouthful, so NETTRO for short, but it exists to advance translational research for neuroendocrine tumors, beginning with pituitary as a critical point of entry. While often benign, pituitary tumors are biologically complex. They can offer insight into more aggressive NETs, including those like pancreatic and lung and gastrointestinal cancers. But by bridging the patient experience with that scientific discovery, NETTRO seeks to improve treatment outcomes, accelerate innovation, and just really fostering a collaborative approach across the entire NET community. And I think translational research is really bringing all those parties together, to work with patients from the very beginning, before the words clinical trial is even discussed, and during the discussions about aims and research goals, and carrying that involvement all the way through to the clinic and the patient and back again. There's other neuroendocrine tumor groups out there, and their focus is more on neuroendocrine cancers, or there's other pituitary groups that focus on like primarily patient support. And all those areas are critical. I'm simply filling a gap and want to bring networks together and not compete. I think as far as with, the strengths of NETTRO and bringing all of that, maybe talking about smaller groups and things that,
yes, yeah,
I've attended a lot of conferences in the past, and trainings for patients involved in life sciences. And at the time, my eyes and ears were just opened, right? I learned a lot. I've probably spent close to 100 hours on all the free webinars I could get my hands on, ranging from how to start a nonprofit and all the legal stuff and best practices and sustainability with donors and board management, working with volunteers, et cetera. So NETTRO is built first like a business, a board with skill sets to run an organization. You've got legalities, you've got promotion, financial aspects, as well as influence from actual patients. But I love to network and meet new people. And there's just not anything that I'm scared to try. And I think that's really served as the backbone of NETTRO is, just developing community, asking questions, listen, and then grow together for the greater good of the patient. And as of this recording, we're still pending 501c3 status, but we continue to develop our policies and procedures and programs. And, so we can just start off running when we get that letter in the mail. And when I look at other newer patient groups or advocacy organizations, they too are starting out of necessity. Sometimes it's a mom or a dad with a child who's battling a disease, or adult patients, or, caregivers that just want to make a difference. But what that does come with is a small group that's passionate and they have a drive. And they also have flexibility, I think, to accomplish some of these miracles that they're searching for. Smaller groups often are more nimble than larger organizations. There's fewer layers of approval, fewer competing priorities, and hopefully less politics standing between an idea and an action. And if pharma needs to move quickly on a survey or patient insight session, community message or something, sometimes those smaller groups can really respond a little bit quicker in those instances. But the passion in a smaller patient group is always something you can simply not manufacture elsewhere. These people are living the disease, or they've lost someone to it, and they show up because they have to, not really because it's their job. And that kind of authenticity really resonates with patients in a way that large scale campaigns sometimes can't. But they have a very tight-knit community, trusted relationships, and their members listen to them. So when pharma is trying to reach out and find a patient population, a small but deeply connected organization can really open doors that no marketing budget can buy. And I think, that's a very unique standpoint. And then they also bring unfiltered insight, I like to say, without a large board or communication team softening the message. These smaller organizations will tell you exactly what patients are experiencing, what they fear, what they need, and what's not working. And I think that honest feedback is really invaluable during drug development, trial design, post-approval support, whatever's needed. So that relationship and partnering together early with that small organization, hopefully you'll grow with them, right? And it builds that foundation of genuine trust that tends to be just far more durable than transactional engagement. I think it's a question I can't answer by myself, but I did ask around to some other patient leaders because I wanted to get their insight. One said that they've never had a pharma partner reach out to them. And I was like, what? So, it could be for a variety of reasons, but, in the rare disease space, you might sometimes be dealing with more than an N of one situation. And it's hard for even patients to find one another, let alone an industry partner locating a group to work with. Often patient groups will be the ones reaching out to pharmaceutical partners in hopes of creating a partnership, because they're first looking for a treatment, anything to help them. And second, they're looking for education. How do we navigate the industry side of things? They don't know. But we learn a lot, though, too, is that each company is unique in its structure. Where is that patient advocacy role? Do they even have one? Is that role under research and development? Is it under medical affairs? Each company is going to have their own way of making that contact, and they have an idea of priorities that they themselves have to deliver upon, right? And so similar to patient organizations, we're all different in our goals and our capabilities and our manpower and where we're at in our growth, so how does one navigate that? Well, we hope to develop relationships and learn about each other's patterns and learn about how our structures are. And the goal really should be to reduce confusion, find out what works for both parties. So an industry partner might reach out for the first time to a patient leader, and their goal should just be to understand the patient and the disease that they're dealing with. You're going to already have, or someone who comes in already having a list of needs or goals that their management gave them is likely just going to miss out on finding out what serves that patient community the best, even if you're even lucky then to get a second meeting. But assumptions can be made by reading published articles in scientific journals, but they do touch on a lot of important things. But I think the patient story and personal experience isn't usually captured, and you just don't want to miss out by already having an objective. I've seen personalities just get in the way sometimes, where we're all human, we all have human natures, and if you don't jive with that person, then it sort of just sets a bad taste in the mouth. And that happens both directions, right? From trying to get to know a patient or trying to get to know a representative. And sometimes if you're just coming across with, I have a 9-to-5 job and I just need to check the box, that you can't hide that very well. So I think it depends really on, who's in those roles, and you don't end up getting as many opportunities with that patient group if there's multiple pharma company stakeholders, you hope that objectively everybody gets the same treatment or time or attention. But inevitably, if that connection isn't there, that patient group may start to just be less and less involved with you. I think the perception or stereotype exists for a reason, because it's true. It's based on the reality that patients were contacted for one thing, to help provide enrollment for a clinical trial, right? Laws have been put into place over the years to protect people in human trials. Now we've got the internet and AI, and that makes information easier to learn. It makes patients more connected with each other globally. They have access to the same information that industry and clinicians do, in a matter of speaking, and they're able to bridge the gap between the lived experience and textbook data, I think. And I think the stories are changing. Groups are becoming more accepting of one another. You just can't ignore it. And I think especially in the rare disease space, patients still need treatments. If they have a treatment, then they're looking for better ones. They need a better quality of life, period. They need mental health support. They need education. And they still need help spreading awareness so that diagnosis can happen faster. As one patient leader said, we need each other in order to do that. And I think pharma partners are just, one of these several pillars that the patient community relies on. And we want patients to be served. We want a seat at the table when research aims are being discussed before, developing a trial. But without this, I think it just slows down advancement. Pharma is still going to develop and charge for medications even without talking with patients, but they may not address the real problem. And that just causes a waste of both time and money, as well as human quality of life. And I think that's what brought the stigma. Yeah. But patients do benefit also from the success of pharma companies. Even if patient groups work with scientists to patent a therapeutic or device or medication, we still can't outperform the reach that pharma has when it comes to placing those therapeutics into the hands of clinicians, right? Or working with regulatory agencies or payers. There's always going to be a challenge when people don't get along, but like all businesses, there's a champion somewhere that can be in your corner. And, in my personal position, what do I have to lose? I'd much rather continue a discussion and find a way to work together. But on the other hand, if I've worked with you over and over and the same issues keep persisting, I need to move on. I think, that's an area where practice has genuinely improved over the past few years. Learning to engage patient advocacy organizations at the research stage, not when the drug is ready for launch. And in rare disease, patient groups often hold decades of natural history data, registries, or information that no pharma company could ever build independently. So I think there's a shift in acknowledging that patients and caregivers understand the disease burden in ways that clinical endpoints often miss. You don't see that. And so things like fatigue, cognitive fog, caregiver strain, the social cost of infusion schedules, those don't always show up in primary endpoints, but matter enormously to the people that are living with the disease. There were some published findings that show the differences in physician-reported outcomes versus patient-reported outcomes. And sometimes they're extremely different across all disease types. And we know this, but now we need to take action together to try to change that. I think companies that are investing in patient-reported outcome development alongside clinical programs that bring patients into the study design, they have conversations, they tend to produce results that are much more meaningful and much more defensible to regulators and payers and even internal demands that are needed. So, we're small and tight knit. And so word travels fast.
Yeah.
Especially if a company is overselling a prospectus or they're elusive about why a trial failed, those companies that have built a lasting trust tend to be, communicating those setbacks honestly and explaining, well, this is how the regulatory pathway works for us. This is how we have to go about it. Those conversations are a lot easier to be had if you have a relationship built. Just being, I guess, transparent with one another. So it's almost like, operating with a PR lens in a way, and as friendship, I guess. But I think they've genuinely done good work building compassionate, useful, expanded access and patient assistant programs that really do bridge the gap between trial participation and commercial availability. But sometimes we've waited years and years and years for treatment options, and there are companies that handle it well and build the kind of loyalty that sustains long-term relationships. But I guess, on the other hand of industry leaders, I think, should also understand that patient organizations, they do have a ton of work to do. They've done a ton of work to get where they're at, all while tending to traumatic medical needs. They're volunteers typically doing the best they can, trying to make a difference. It's not just a job. And so they can't clock out at 5:00. They're consistently disrupted by, having to wait on hold for this, trying to do insurance pre-approvals. The list goes on, and scheduling their day in hopes that they don't have to spend time in bed. But they're having to figure it all out and paying the bills and just not having time to heal from the trauma that they've been through. Kind of can show up in conversation or goals, and just having a mutual understanding and awareness of what that patient is going through can really go a long way. Well, I have my own experiences, but I also draw on the views of other leaders, so it's, which I appreciate, because there's still nuances between all of our groups, right, and what we truly need. But in no particular order, I think a well-resourced patient organization can do more to get, real answers regarding patient needs and trial prep and access to providers or researchers, and, overall gain that community trust that a consultancy outside of the community wouldn't be able to provide. But no one cares as much about the patient's well-being as the patient. So no matter what the size of the organization is, just help them get the resources and support that they need to help you flourish, and they'll deliver. An organization called Rare Patient Voice recently surveyed over 2,000 US patients for their thoughts on participating in co-design for clinical trials, and including the question of, well, what would encourage you to participate in co-design activities? And their top 3 answers were a clear explanation of the process, which you'd get by talking with patients in development, flexible scheduling, and compensation for their time. So to further elaborate on that, I would mention that, you're building that relationship with people that have or are currently going through trauma, and they may not always be emotionally or physically available. And that's just important to consider when having conversations about deadlines, the real things that you have, or metrics that a company is trying to run by. But there could be some pitfalls that an organization might be overly generous with their resources, and in turn, not really asking for what their patient community needs, deserves. A friend of mine once said, when it's well framed, the patient organization can know its own worth and help guide pharma to see that. But patient groups or professional organizations can deliver so much value, but sometimes they just need help in response, and trying to find sources of income that they may not realize they need or have to offer, just in navigating those things. And I think it's just important. the way that things are communicated and discussed. And I could go on, but yeah. A group can have their list of programs that they have, and they can tell their membership, hey, these are the things that we're going to work on. And I think going back to one point when you said there's that stigma, it's like, we're going to do these programs and they're going to help support you guys as our membership. And we happen to have them financially supported by this company. So I think the messaging and just the way that the relationship is structured or how it's communicated to others can spin the positivity and make it make sense. Well, for me, since our organization is focused on translational research, then we've identified, 5 or 6 other stakeholders outside of pharma. They're, our patients and caregivers, first and foremost, other patient organizations, we're not operating in a silo, researchers, clinicians of all types, and also introducing payers for billing and development and bringing them to the table. Sometimes it could be applicable to bring in policy or regulatory leaders as well. So especially now with so many changes in the American regulatory space, I really empathize with the pharma industry and just trying to make pipeline decisions and planning. It's got to be virtually impossible. Outside of that, we could easily argue that funders or academic medical centers, and others are also stakeholders. And then get further detailed into those, nurse practitioners versus doctors versus informatics, and things like that. But for me, this covers the spectrum from bench to bedside and back again. And I say back again because once the treatment or device or change in quality of life happens and it's realized, the patient feedback is still important and it needs to get back to the lab to make further improvements or adjustments for future studies. Since my organization is sort of branching out and growing and beginning out, I don't know about policy. I didn't know about politics, but I found the Rare Disease Advisory Council, and learning. And again, because of open ears, you figure it out. And so we have monthly get-togethers with other patient advocacy groups and talking about policy that we would like to see happen as an entire community, because there are certain things we all have in common. And from there, you have then relationships with sometimes politicians or sometimes just the committees that you need to be in front of. So let those professionals help guide you. There's those people in place that bridge those gaps. And I think, again, one-on-one conversations is where it all meets at, and I looked back at how I'd started developing the network and meeting like you and going to events. It's 100% grown from networking. Yeah. It's not cold calling. It's just building relationships and like, oh, I know this person, they can help you. And I'm developing this program. Who's done it before? Let's not reinvent the wheel, or what's the best practice? And so it's not hard. It's just takes effort, but it's all the homegrown relationship building with no matter what industry you're in or where your expertise is. It's learning from one another and just being open. Again, it's all about networking from how it started. But, at this particular time, I'm sort of in the middle of an initiative related to research. And I met a researcher in 2023. So just, a couple years ago, who was also diagnosed with Cushing's disease. And after learning that treatment often fails or that the disease comes back, she pivoted her focus to understudied pituitary tumors, right? And as both a patient and a scientist, And with a $14 million grant from NIH, she started BioPitNet in 2024. And BioPitNet is the national biorepository and resource for pituitary neuroendocrine tumor translational research. It's an open source, clinically relevant, deep tumor phenotyping platform, biorepository, the first of its kind. But she and I worked well together, and she asked me to lead the community engagement and patient advocacy committee, which essentially means, hey, we're breaking down the silos so that researchers, clinicians, and patients all engage with one another to truly adopt translational research, right? And ultimately bring a better quality of life to the patient. So I think, in this role, it was sort of a blank slate. What am I going to do with this? And so I worked with the multiple institutions around the United States who are part of this research collaboration and developed resources like, a website that we've got going, newsletter, patient-focused brochure, social media presence, speaking engagements like this, and partnerships, just to bring awareness to not only pituitary tumor research, but what translational research looks like. And what research program do you know that has this committee instilled? It's like an advertising branch for your research, right? Usually you just rely on the end publication, but we're engaging along the way. And also from that, then starting the nonprofit NETTRO, or the Neuroendocrine Tumor Translational Research Organization. So, when I was diagnosed in 2020 and had brain surgery, none of this was on my bingo card, but I've used both my professional skills and passion to hopefully support a better quality of life, not only for myself, but others, and bring others through that patient lived experience. So, but what did it take to get there? For me personally, it took relationship building and teamwork and being open-minded for collaboration, putting pause on egos, right?
Yeah.
And saying yes to possibilities, which ultimately brings innovation and more targeted approaches to help the patient in the end. And, that's downplaying a lot of what goes on behind the scenes, but I like to think that progress is more sustainable when all parties are involved from the beginning. And, starting a nonprofit, having some flexibility to bring into a research institution scenario, cover a lot of bases. And I think potential industry leaders and patient communities, the future is just endless. I guess, my journey included leaving my career before I even had a diagnosis, which was incredibly hard at the time. But in hindsight, I see clearly that everything happened as it should have, because we learned through those challenges. I think, if I could change one thing, though, it would be to have sought out mental health support much sooner. And, we simply don't use the word trauma enough in rare disease. And I'm over 5 years in remission and still uncovering things about myself that I once wrote off as just rough times, and when you're living with that disease for years, you don't realize how much you just quietly adapt to or push through. Your mental health ends up in the back seat because you've got urgent medical priorities and they take over. And I'm only now starting to dive into that deeper work. So I wish I had someone, a physician ideally, to tell me, mental health support is a big part of your treatment and ongoing package. And I know, for some people, it may have made the road easier or even saved a relationship or a family. Living with rare disease doesn't just challenge your body, it uncovers those layers of grief and isolation, fear, that most people never have to face. And I think the diagnosis sometimes isn't the hardest part. It's realizing that trauma is there, and it could have been there all along, quietly shaping your decisions, your relationships, and staying silent when you're around people that don't understand. It changes you. And mental health awareness has become a priority for me and a lot of other rare disease patients, and organizations are realizing that. And so bringing that awareness to all the stakeholders involved from diagnosis and throughout the bench to bedside process, I think is pretty important.